All right, I'm going to steal your microphone. Welcome back. I hope you've digested lunch. Welcome back to what I think the President called the Australian Civil War located in a different country. I think that was how he was positioning this, an NBN meeting of the minds. So a session on the issues around next generation broadband networks, a national broadband network, and we're lucky enough to have all of the key major players from Australia on the NBN issue. Because they've all got quite interesting things to say and a lot of experience to cover, I'm not going to waste anyone's time too much at the outset so that we can jump in. Very quickly, we have Justin Milne, the non-executive director for NBN, on my left. Next to Justin, we have Michael Cosgrave, who is from ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, where he runs the Infrastructure Regulatory Division. On my right, we have Jane van Beelen from Telstra to give us the industry representation. Jane is the Executive Director of Regulatory Affairs at Telstra. And to Jane's right, we have Richard Beelen from the Australian Communications and Media Authority to bring the other side of the regulatory equation into the picture. We're going to go from, firstly from Justin, to give us the perspective of the NBN code, this new separated wholesale layer, access layer that Australia has put in place as part of this nation-building exercise. Will be followed by Michael to talk about the competition issues which ensue. Jane will give us the industry opinion, and Richard's going to close it out by talking about all of the remaining other issues that haven't been covered. A few things. I think there's three areas that we want to use this session to cover, and I'm going to be looking to all of you. Really the experience that Australia has been through in this journey, how it's played out, but then more importantly are the two issues that flow on from that. What lessons have we learned? What do we take away from this? And how might it be approached now if we were looking at the same issues again? And that becomes particularly pertinent in this part of the world, given a lot of the questions that are re-arising now around how we drive a digital economy forward, how we promote national access in an era of recognition of the importance of data, and that data is now driving so much of our economic growth. How do we look at getting that broadband layer out ubiquitously across national economies as a platform for everything else that's coming? And what do we need to consider in doing that? All of those other service and regulatory issues. So I think they'll take you on an interesting journey with that. Michael, as we discussed, 15 years of experience in 10 minutes, right?
Right.
All of the competition issues in 10 minutes.
Well, in the spirit of collegiality, I want to commence by congratulating Justin and NBN. I know Justin's just come from French Guinea, where the NBN's second satellite has just been launched. There has been a lot of focus on the fibre and other fixed technologies in the NBN rollout. I can. Thanks, Chris. I was in the process of. That's good. Does that work? Yep. Great. Thank you. I was in the process of congratulating NBN around the satellite build, which, as I say, there's been a lot of concentration on fibre deployment in urban infrastructure, but as Justin rightly says, in terms of bridging the metro rural digital divide, I suspect the satellite build may well, when we come to review it many years in the future, be seen as one of the successes of the NBN, and of course that's a rural broadband initiative that seeks to address areas in which people bluntly otherwise are not going to invest. Secondly, NBN does meet its rollout targets, and they are very ambitious over the next 3 years. Australia, so I guess I'm dealing with the benefit side at the moment. Australia will clearly meet what the current government's broadband targets are, which is essentially 25 megabits download to 100% of consumers and 50 megs to 90% of consumers. The issue, I guess broadly, as consumers I want with rollouts of major infrastructure, they'll be happy provided they don't have to pay any more. And that, of course, goes to the other side of the issue around affordability and costs. Justin's already referred to the immediate costs of the NBN. Rough terms, 50 billion Australian dollars is the currently modelled peak funding scenario by NBN, with a government contribution, I think, of 29.5, 30 billion, which, just to put that into context for the audience, I went to the on my back of the envelope figures, and I went to the local currency first, and I think it's I think if the figures, and this is purely back of the envelope, but it's a great sounding number, is 800 billion baht, or perhaps in figures that people can more readily understand, 22 US billion dollars Australian. So a significant immediate financial contribution by government in terms of immediate cost. What's not clearer, what's not yet clear and won't be clear for some time in terms of costs is the less immediate costs of doing it the way we're doing it. That's clearly not known at the moment. If, as a cautious regulator, I can quote somebody else, but I'm here quoting the independent policy review commissioned by the current government around the structure that we've done this under. We've done this under clearly a highly unusual structure in creating a de facto network monopoly and reverting to government ownership and taxpayer funding of telco infrastructure. And where that goes in the medium term is not a given. Clearly, we are going to have other debates around industry structure in the likely in the next decade or so post-construction of a network. The country is, I think, fixated, and the decision's been taken, and the policy approach of constructing the network is now largely bipartisan. What happens with it post-construction certainly is not. Look, just one other observation. Justin inevitably made a number of observations around history, contextual observations around history, and they are very important obligations, because they tell us, like any case study, that context is everything, which of course is a first and primary message in the question that we were asked to address around what practical insights might other countries derive from the history of the NBN. Well, it may be that you can't necessarily derive that much. It's interesting, in the session amongst regulators over the last couple of days, national connectivity issues were issues that, when we were thinking about matters that could reasonably addressed on either a regional or a international basis, we pretty much consign national connectivity issues as being issues that couldn't be thus addressed. And there's very good reasons for that. There are such differences in demographics, physical demographics, financial capacities of government to intervene. Oh, it's going to be quick. Okay, in the same way as Australia has, that makes those. You've interrupted my flow pattern. That makes issues of general import very difficult to divine. History is contestable. I'd have a slightly different perspective to Justin on the history of 10 years ago, and I'm not going to go to that in detail, given the chair's given me 2 minutes. But there has been, in Australia's case, perhaps decisions taken 2 decades ago, or absences of rigorous cost-benefit analysis done at the time of the privatisation of Telstra, and at the time fundamental decisions are made around entry with other technologies like cable infrastructure, which have been the fundamental of infrastructure competition in other countries, and where decisions were, where, as Justin said, the predominant cable TV provider was fundamentally half owned by the telecoms provider. So if I was going for three messages of general import, they would be these. They would be essentially, and you'd expect a competition agency to say these. And in some ways they're self-evident, although their implementation and execution can be challenging for a whole range of public policy and political reasons. Competitive market processes are central to diminishing the prospect of connectivity concerns in those geographic infrastructure markets where it's economic to invest, and I'd argue that there was some distortion to those processes in Australia. Infrastructure markets like communications inevitably have the potential to be concentrated. Major regulatory interventions that fundamentally affect market structure and entry are relatively few in number, despite the fact that we constantly wrestle with the dynamic between the promotion of competition and the promotion of investment, efficient investment. In any decision taken, and they're generally taken by governments, need to take dynamic long-term impacts of competition and balance them against shorter-term cost considerations. And finally, and this has not been mentioned, and it's relevant to both Justin and Telstra, and is interesting in terms of the discussion around universal service obligations that occurred in the last session. We have had in Australia a history of embedding social policy objectives, and particularly universal service obligations, on our primary provider of network services, firstly in the instance of Telstra, and certainly in the case of NBN. And in both cases, I'd argue, they have potentially a fairly significant distortionary effect. So I'd be putting what I'd hope's a relatively self-evident proposition for this audience, that that transparently implementing those sort of obligations in a way which minimally distorts effective competition in markets where investment is viable without intervention is crucial, and that hasn't been done in relation to the national broadband network. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Michael. So you guys understand the job, right? If you get the question right, he's going to tell you what history really looked like. You get to come back and ask him about that afterwards, and he'll give you the counter opinion. We've established that it's a collegiate environment. You're among friends. So Jane will give us the industry representative picture.
Thanks, Peter. As you've heard, the rollout of the NBN has had just a few implications for Telstra. I thought I might list some of them. We are handing over and or disconnecting our copper and HFC access networks to NBN, disconnecting in the fibre footprint and transferring assets where they're of use to NBN Co. And that is the means by which Telstra is structurally separating. So this policy delivers the structural separation in the fixed line network, in that once the NBN is complete, the infrastructure, the fixed access network has either all been disconnected or transferred, and Telstra is then an RSP on the NBN without its own fixed access network, and we are, ergo, structurally separated. So some substantial regulatory obligations do flow from all of that. In the meantime, we are subject to quite stringent equivalence and transparency obligations as we progress. So that is in relation to our legacy fixed line business. And we have a special responsibility to actually manage the disconnection element of the migration of customers to the NBN. And there's certain timeframes and regulatory arrangements around that. We are being paid to cooperate with the NBN policy. That was a negotiation with the government and the NBN. Justin used the expression gun to the head. I will make no comment. However, on that I would say there's no doubt that the NBN policy was value destructive for Telstra, and that the deal we were ultimately able to do did not recover all of that lost value, but rather was decided by the directors of Telstra and ultimately voted on by the shareholders of Telstra as being in the company's interests, given the alternative. And that was the context in which the deal was done. We are therefore becoming an NBN customer, an RSP, and one of many acquiring services on a non-discriminatory basis from this wholesale-only NBN. We also have a role, though, pursuant to separate contracts, to help with some of the planning, design, construction and maintenance of the NBN. We're not alone in that. There are other companies who have some role to play there. We still have some responsibilities, though, in relation to access infrastructure, in particular in new estates. If NBN is not able to get there, if they're a small estate, then actually Telstra rolls out the copper infrastructure still to new estates today. And we do that, among other reasons, because we are still the universal service provider. So we still have an obligation to provide a fixed line voice service to every premise in Australia upon request. And that, in a country like Australia, is a fairly costly exercise. And there is a universal service fund, which is part funded by government and part funded by industry, which contributes to that cost. All of this attracts intense political, bureaucratic, regulatory and media interest, as you will appreciate. I'm not going to take you through the detail of all of those arrangements, but I thought I might share some of our learnings from this experience of structurally separating, migrating to the NBN and becoming an RSP, and a little bit about the future of Telstra in light of the change that this makes to our business. I am inclined to say that structurally separating Telstra is a bit like juggling while riding a bicycle on a tightrope. It's I think someone's used the word complex, and it's certainly a fairly substantial, unprecedented undertaking. A substantial part of our obligations are set out in what's called the structural separation undertaking, which spends about half a page saying that Telstra will structurally separate by transferring its customers onto the NBN, and the balance of the nearly 200 pages sets out the interim equivalence and transparency arrangements that apply to our legacy business in the interim. There's also a migration plan that sits under that sets out our obligations, with some detail about disconnecting. So this plan basically sets out the migration process to get every fixed line customer in the country that's connected to our network. There is one other network operator that also has a disconnection arrangement with NBN, but we have most of them. And basically it works like this. NBN builds out their network and declares an area ready for service, and that commences an 18-month window in which all customers need to migrate in that area off their fixed line infrastructure and onto the NBN. They do that by reaching agreement with a retail service provider. It might be their current retail service provider, or they may choose to change, and connecting to the NBN through that retail service provider, because of course NBN Co is wholesale only. Then at the end of that 18-month period, if they haven't connected, then there is a mandatory disconnection process in place. But before then, once they're connected with their retail service provider, and there's up to 10 of them in most NBN areas, then that service provider or that customer then arranges with Telstra for the disconnection, and then we use our standard disconnection processes to do that. We do have to do that mandatory disconnection at the end of the 18-month period, and as you can appreciate, there are often challenges about that. Customers are receiving many communications from the many RSPs that are trying to sell them NBN services, but sometimes they do nothing. And they receive notices from NBN to remind them that NBN is in the area and that they have to disconnect, and sometimes they still do nothing. And so there are customers that get to the end of that period, and there is the potential for mandatory disconnection. The mixed technology model complicates that a little bit because the disconnection process does vary a little bit by technology. As an RSP and as the disconnecting carrier, our goal is to try and make this as simple as we possibly can for the customer, but there's certainly a lot of paddling going on underneath the water. There is also the challenge of not always knowing, particularly in relation to wholesale local loop unbundled services or line sharing services, what the service is being used for. There's a special arrangement in place for what's called special services, so the ones that don't yet really have a go-to product on the NBN, but you don't know necessarily what those services are being used for by the end customer. And even your own retail customers could have voice lines in place that are not used for voice telephony, but are in fact used for a fire alarm or for a lift phone or for some kind of medical alert device, which is provided by a third-party service provider that we know nothing about. These are some of the sort of policy, you can see some of the policy issues that arise here because we are at risk of mandatorily disconnecting essential services. And it's quite possible that the end user may not even realise until they need them and they're not there that they've been disconnected. So there have been many challenges, and what we're really learning in the process is that it's really, while Telstra has this obligation to disconnect, it really is a multi-stakeholder exercise to make sure that the providers of the various services all play their role in making sure that the customer can have as simple and as seamless as possible migration to the NBN. So far that's been actually, surprisingly, going relatively smoothly. But there is certainly no end, as I said, of attention on what could go wrong and trying to make sure that everybody's responsibilities are taken care of. The equivalence regime we've had in place in Telstra in relation to our fixed legacy services for about 4 years, and that imposes substantial obligations in relation to equivalence of service, in relation to ring fencing our retail and wholesale and networks businesses, and providing a lot of transparency both as to our internal product accounts, but also transparency to the regulator about any breaches that occur. So wherever there is, for example, some information that goes about a wholesale customer to a retail part of the business. We had some substantial IT issues because Telstra was built from day one as a vertically integrated entity. And we then had these obligations to basically ensure separation of customer data, and that has certainly taken substantial remediation on our part to address those issues. We're becoming a retailer on somebody else's network for the first time, and basically that does, mean pretty substantial changes. Obviously, we're moving from being vertically integrated, and Justin and Michael have both alluded to the regulatory challenges, and certainly Telstra's vertical integration was seen as a problem. We now have a vertically separated industry structure that we're moving to, and I don't think anybody would suggest that it's nirvana. So there are certainly pros and cons of various industry structures. Telstra, as a vertically integrated business, is very much in touch with its own retail customers. Their demand drives investment and innovation, including in our network. And by virtue of access obligations and equivalence obligations, our wholesale customers actually benefit from that. That's how vertical integration largely works. When you separate the network provider on the one hand from all the RSPs on the other, you do have a little bit of a disconnect, and it's then up to the RSPs to make sure that they are getting from NBN Co what they need to supply their end customers. Also, we're moving from being a company that was effectively able to fulfil all those community service obligations, universal service obligations, with some funding, but also substantially through internal cross-subsidies. Of course, once you start paying a standard access fee to a third-party network operator, the ability to cross-subsidise the low income, the low spend, the vulnerable customers certainly it becomes more of a challenge, and not necessarily something that should rest with just one RSP. We, as an RSP, we are one of many, as I said, who are now customers of NBN Co. And that, that, as I said, means that we are all representing the interests of our end customers to the network operator. That means that we've had to have conversations with NBN Co about what service levels our customers expect, and that in an environment where actually we are still subject to end RSP level service quality regulation. So being able to meet our service level obligations has been part of those discussions. We are also, of course, all acutely sensitive to NBN's pricing, and there are debates at the moment about the level of NBN's pricing, and in particular their pricing of CVC capacity, which is, what basically the volumetric component of their price. So as the customers start to use more data on the NBN, you need to provision more capacity to support them. And the price of that capacity is something that is being hotly debated. NBN, of course, relies on its price structure to fund the build of this, substantial cost network. But at the same time, we as an industry are seeking to migrate our customers onto the NBN, as Michael said, without them suffering some kind of price shock. And of course, we want to be encouraging them to use the NBN to its full capacity, not to sort of be suggesting that they could perhaps just only use a little bit so it doesn't cost so much. It's not really what we're going to be after. And then the other thing that, of course, is a concern in a number of quarters is the fact that as the NBN continues to look for ways to actually cover the costs of building this network, there is that risk of scope creep. What's been created as a government-owned, government-funded monopoly, has opportunities, no doubt, to look for other ways to earn revenues. But there's a real risk there of displacing private investment, or of, effectively in Europe they would call it state aid. A company ended up competing with private companies in competitive markets, but with this sort of policy advantage. And that issue, potentially arises in future as well. Finally, there's the question of what does this all mean for Telstra's future? We're no longer going to be a fixed line access infrastructure provider, and we now have a vision to be a world-class technology company that empowers our customers to connect. That is born of the fact that we are having to change the nature of our company. The NBN policy will mean that annually we have between $2 and $3 billion less EBIT, and we need to replace that EBIT. Many retirees and pensioners have their savings invested in Telstra because of the dividend stream, so we certainly need to be able to find new sources of growth. One of those sources of growth is actually our businesses in the Asian region. We've got about 3,000 employees in 22 countries outside Australia, most of them in Asia, and over many decades we've actually been a provider of undersea cables in the region, and most recently acquired PACnet, which means that we have, I think now, the biggest provider of undersea cables in the Asian region. But also more broadly, we've got over 2,000 points of presence in countries around the world. We've also got a joint venture in Indonesia with Telecom Telstra, and we have a hub in Singapore with our regional enterprise applications and services business. The product house for that is there, and also our Murudi incubator program is based in Singapore because we are trying to invest in technology startups and at the same time build an innovative culture inside our company. So it's a pretty exciting time to be at Telstra. I think my parting message on NBN would be don't try this at home. You may have issues with vertical integration. You almost definitely will want to roll out high-speed broadband connectivity to the entire country. But I think all of us would say if you had a blank piece of paper, you probably wouldn't do it quite the way we have in Australia.
All right. One of the issues I hope we come back to is that idea of that revenue stream that was coming into Telstra having to replace that, because as other countries look at this, that whole complex question of how you effectively renationalise the incumbent operator and what that means for a listed company, and a very, very big listed company, is profoundly challenging. Richard, everything else, 10 minutes.
Yeah.
All the other issues that weren't covered.
I won't even try that, but I will tell you where the ACMA fits into all of this. We have an oversight role, I suppose, largely, but we have specific roles in, of course, allocation of spectrum for, in NBNCo's case, the fixed wireless component in parts, and of course, in relation to satellite coordination and so on. For the satellites, we look after certain access rules for installation of broadband infrastructure, technical rules for fixed broadband technologies, but most importantly, I think, consumer protection matters. So some of the implications of the NBN rollout for our responsibilities, of course, it's creating a completely new technical and commercial environment, not only in terms of the multiple access technologies, but the fundamental change to the supply chain between the provider of various components of the services and the consumers. So there are subtle but important differences between the different technologies that are being used in the mixed technology model, and there are a number of implications for that in the various technical roles that we undertake. But of course, we're also a facilitator of access to spectrum to enable some of the new technologies. So we had a role to play in the new satellites. And although, having different technologies and different providers in the supply chain isn't a new phenomenon, there is an important issue for consumers in helping them or helping everyone to understand the apportioning of responsibility and getting issues resolved when they arise, and that can be quite challenging. So one effect of the new environment is that consumers can be quite confused about the implications of an installation for their services at home, their home network, their business network, and who's responsible for any problems that arise. And there are early signs of there being problems in these areas. The most common difficulties relate to connections and internet or telephony services that aren't usable or aren't usable in the way that customers expected them to be. And we are seeing these problems arising in relation to NBN services. And it's not a surprise that there might be some difficulty in the creation of a project of this magnitude, but it's important that there's somebody there to keep an eye on these things, and we work closely with the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman, which is an industry-based sort of complaint service in Australia, to keep a track of where the hotspots are, and so that we can get on top of them before things get out of hand. There are some service provision and service continuity challenges that are not immediately obvious. Jane's touched on some of these. So, for example, unlike the traditional old-style telephony services, voice services over the NBN are power, dependent on mains power. And, it's important that consumers understand the implications of that, and that what options there are available to them to ensure continuity of their voice services if there's a power blackout, for example. Jane mentioned security services, fire alarms, medical services, lift phones, EFTPOS terminals. All of these things need to be considered when you're switching over to the NBN service. The cabling that consumers have in their houses or in their businesses might not be suitable, and people need to be aware so that they can discover any incompatibilities before they become really important. Our immediate regulatory interest in all of this is to manage the consumer risks, including to health and safety, and the interoperability of standard telephone services and access to the emergency call service in Australia, 000, 911 in the US, and so on. It's interesting to think that historically, given the environment that we're in now, historically telecommunications was a really stable sector. Consumer expectations were pretty simple. They expected a fixed voice service that worked. The network structure was simple. Telstra's legacy copper network was the only network. It's still by far the largest fixed network. And it delivered a stable fixed network structure. And even the industry has been stable until very recently. Of course, we had the incumbent monopoly, but even when competition was introduced in the 1990s, there were only a couple of new providers, and they provided a pretty simple range of service offerings. And the NBN is just one part of the move away from this relatively stable environment. One of the consequences of the move away from that historical stability, of course, for us at the ACMA, is that the regulatory requirements that were relevant to that are of doubtful relevance now, or will be difficult to apply. Some, anyway. So as Jane mentioned, there's a whole set of obligations placed solely on the dominant provider. And when the advantage that it provided from vertical integration no longer exists, then it's unlikely to be in a position to, or to be willing to, continue to meet some of those obligations. And then, among other things, it's a matter for us to decide whether we forbear, perhaps in some circumstances, from insisting upon the application of some of those obligations, or more likely add our voice to the calls to government to address some of those obligations, or how those obligations are imposed on the industry more widely. And of course, universal service is one of those. There is a review of the universal service obligation in Australia currently underway. The current legislation is all about the legacy fixed line telephone service and it's a very interesting and big question as to what it should be, if anything, in the future. So both the universal service obligation and the whole framework of consumer safeguards is currently under review in Australia. There are matters of constancy, continuity in these issues, and especially in relation to consumer protection, constants are those issues that relate to advertising, to point of sale information, billing, payment, and particularly complaint handling, and particularly the management of change of provider. They're going to be of ongoing relevance in an NBN environment. A lot of these matters are addressed in an industry code of practice, which is enforceable by the ACMA, and that will continue to be, I'm sure, an important instrument in the new environment. And of course, as far as possible, it's incumbent upon the regulator to adapt its approaches to things in the context of the changes that are occurring all around us. But I suppose a parting message or a single message would be to say that it is, I think, really important that if you're embarking on a project of this type and of this magnitude, that there is someone in the game who is able to have a high-level overview from a citizen and consumer perspective. And we were quite anxious at the ACMA in the early stages of the NBN project that everyone, there are a lot of people involved in this project, as far as possible, get in a room from time to time so that everyone can see all of the issues that are being raised from all different perspectives. And the ACMA was well placed to facilitate that sort of thing. And I think when you're, if any of you are, as many of you are, I know, contemplating this kind of project, having someone in the room who can take that higher overview perspective from the consumer's perspective is an important thing.
Okay. Given that's everything you ever wanted to know but were afraid to ask about national broadband networks in less than an hour, can I get you to